Welcome to the Military Aviation Preservation Society American History Program. In this presentation, we will be touching upon the concept of change. The primary focus will be on change in American culture and society as it relates to events leading up to, during, and after World War II. This program was designed to support high school classroom instruction dealing with American History Content Statement 21. This area addresses how World War II either caused the temporary changes in American society necessary to win the conflict, or started or sped up the process of long-term cultural change. World War II also brought to the forefront of American society underlying bias, prejudice, and in some cases hatred for specific segments of our own population. We also hope that this presentation will assist you in understanding the nature of change by showing how events, such as war, impact the norms of our society. Change does not come easy for any of us, nor does it come with the speed that many of us expect. Real change is an evolutionary, not revolutionary process. Studies of history show that governments, institutions, and political and geographic boundaries can be changed through revolution or war. Many of these changes occur rapidly. The nature and impact of this type of change also depends on whether or not you are on the winning side, as the history that is passed on and studied is often written by the victors. The winners often have the power to shape historical narratives through speeches, sermons, news media, books, public images, movies, and a range of other mediums. These mediums are powerful venues for establishing political ideologies and shaping personal assumptions about the way the world works. If you look throughout history, even at the world today, you will see that values, beliefs, and attitudes cannot be changed the same way or with the speed that many would like. These are typically learned behaviors that are taught and passed on between generations by those with authority that are believed and trusted. The result of these learned norms often serves to emphasize differences and can result in situational, cultural, religious, or geographic bias, prejudice, and too often hostility. World War II brought many changes to the fabric of American society. Many of those changes caused by the war, rationing for example, only survived as long as the war continued. Others, such as the persecution of citizens of Japanese descent, were a result of long-standing prejudice and fear brought about by wartime hysteria. After the war, America quickly went back to business as usual. Much of the bias and hatred caused by the conflict subsided over time. In other areas, however, seeds of change had been planted, although it took many years for those changes to bear fruit, and some are yet to be realized. It is only through the lens of history that we can see the changes that have occurred. This program will examine how the war impacted a generation of Americans with such wartime programs as rationing. We will also focus on how World War II caused, started, or sped up change for four previously marginalized groups: African Americans, Native Americans, Japanese Americans, and women. We hope to show in this lesson that each of these groups, despite mistreatment, sometimes throughout the history of this nation, contributed to our ultimate victory, a victory that often did little to advance their cause. The Tuskegee Airmen is a popular name of a group of African American pilots who fought in World War II. Officially, they formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Corps. We often consider the Tuskegee Airmen to be pioneers in American military history, but to give them the honor of being the first to break the race barrier in our military history would be a failure to honor those that came before them. At the beginning of the American Revolution, the British promised freedom to slaves who fought for the crown. Americans eventually allowed blacks to join the ranks of the Continental Army, and by the end of the Revolutionary War, about 1/5 of the Continental Army were African American. They served as soldiers, guides, messengers, and spies for both sides during the conflict. During the War of 1812, about 1/4 of the personnel in the American naval squadrons under the command of Commodore Oliver Perry during the Battle of Lake Erie were black. No legal restrictions regarding the enlistments of blacks were placed on the Navy because of its chronic shortage of manpower. The issues of emancipation and military service came to a head at the onset of the Civil War. News from Fort Sumter set off a rush by free black men to enlist in U.S. military units. They were turned away, however, because a federal law dating from 1792 barred Negroes from bearing arms for the U.S. Army. The War Department issued General Order 143 on May 22, 1863, creating the United States Colored Troop. Just 2 months later, in July of 1863, the black soldiers of the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers lost 2/3 of their officers and half of their troops in their attack on Fort Wagner, South Carolina. This was to be only one example of the heroic service of black troops. By the end of the Civil War, roughly 179,000 black men, or 10% of the Union Army, served as soldiers, and another 19,000 served in the Navy. Nearly 40,000 black soldiers died over the course of the war, 30,000 of infection or disease. By war's end, 16 black soldiers had been awarded the Medal of Honor for their valor. This was a war that was supposed to end the institution of slavery. It did not, however, end the practices of racism and segregation either in the military or in the United States. War Department tradition and policy mandated the segregation of African Americans into separate military units staffed by white officers. This had been done previously with the 9th Cavalry, 10th Cavalry, 24th Infantry, and 25th Infantry. The 9th Cavalry, for example, served on the western frontiers, participated in the Apache Wars from 1875 to 1881, and fought bravely alongside Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders at the battles of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill in 1898. Under General John J. Pershing, the regiment fought in the punitive expedition in Mexico in 1916. The regiment spent World War I in the Philippines. In October of 1925, the Army War College submitted a study titled The Use of Negro Manpower in War. The study was based on the performance of black soldiers during World War I. The resulting report, however, reflected the deep-seated racial prejudice regarding African Americans that was common among many white Americans during the early and middle years of the 20th century. In reading these comments, it is important to remember that they must be viewed in the historical context of that period in our history. The introduction to the study listed the following facts bearing upon the problem. The Negro is physically qualified for combat duty. He is, by nature, subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He is most susceptible to the influence of crowd psychology. He cannot control himself in the face of danger to the extent that a white man can. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. He is mentally inferior to the white man. In past wars, the Negro has made a fair laborer. As a technician and a fighter, he has been inferior to the white man. While we will find these statements offensive today, they help us to understand the intense opposition that President Roosevelt and the Tuskegee Airmen faced over the issue of allowing African Americans to pilot military aircraft. Not unclassified till 1988, the War College study became the central reference for developing service policies and was referenced in a number of congressional hearings conducted during World War II. However, one of the conclusions reached by the War College study was that the door should not be closed against the Negro because of his failures in the war. He should be given a fair opportunity to perform the tasks of war for which he is qualified or may qualify himself under a sound plan of organization, training, and leadership. He should be measured by the same standards applied to the white man. Finally, he should be given an opportunity to demonstrate as a race his competency for combat duty. Despite their honorable service throughout our history, African Americans were relegated to duties as cooks and truck drivers, usually in segregated units, at the start of World War II. Even with those limitations, they served heroically. One in particular served notice of what the future would bring. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, leading to the American entry in World War II. Doris Miller was an African-American sailor who joined the Navy in 1939. Assigned as the ship's cook, he went to the deck of his ship, the USS West Virginia, when the attack began. He saw that the captain had been wounded and helped carry him to safety. Miller next joined in the defense of his ship. He hadn't been trained in weapons use, but he took over an anti-aircraft machine gun, firing it until he exhausted its ammunition. Miller and his fellow sailors had to abandon the ship, and he survived the battle to receive the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest decoration awarded for valor in combat. He was the first African American awarded the Navy Cross. On December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after his courageous effort during the Pearl Harbor attack, Miller's parents were notified of their son's death aboard the escort carrier Liscum Bay during the Battle of Tarawa. Miller was assigned to the Liscum Bay as a cook. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African-American military aviators in the United States Armed Forces. During World War II, African Americans in many U.S. states were still subject to the Jim Crow laws. These laws, in effect from 1876 to 1965, encouraged racial segregation in all public facilities in the former Confederacy. Before the Tuskegee Airmen, no African American had been a military pilot. In 1917, however, African American Eugene Bullard served in the French Air Corps prior to the U.S. entry into World War I. Despite this experience, when he applied for service with the American Air Corps, he was rejected. Because he was not allowed to serve in an American unit, Bullard returned to duty with the French. On April 3, 1939, an appropriations bill was passed by Congress containing an amendment designating funds for training African American pilots. An amendment to that bill provided that the Secretary of War could designate a civilian education school for the training of those pilots. In 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt, over the objection of his top generals, ordered the creation of an all-black flight training program. He took this action 1 day after the NAACP filed suit to force the Department of War to accept black pilot trainees. The Tuskegee program began officially in June of 1941 at the Tuskegee Institute, an all-black college. After primary training at Moton Field, they were moved to the nearby Tuskegee Army Airfield for advanced flight training. Because of strict segregation, the Tuskegee Army Airfield became the only Army installation performing 3 phases of pilot training at a single location. All black flyers were trained at Tuskegee. Unfortunately, the Tuskegee Airmen were subjected to racial discrimination both within and outside the Army. A committee of the United States Congress held hearings during this time, referencing the 1925 War College study, to try to prove that African Americans were physically, intellectually, and psychologically inferior to whites, and should be precluded from such highly technical occupations as flying. Despite these adversities, they trained and flew with distinction. The 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in early 1944, commanded by Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Congress again attacked the Tuskegee Airmen for their lack of aircraft kills as a means to disband them as a failed experiment, despite the fact that they were never assigned air combat and only ground attack roles. In June of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group began flying bomber escort missions. A month later, they received the aircraft that they were to be most associated with, the North American P-51 Mustang. In all, 992 pilots were trained in Tuskegee from 1941 to 1946. 355 were deployed overseas. 84 lost their lives in accidents or combat. The toll included 68 pilots killed in action or accidents, 12 killed in training and non-combat missions, and 32 captured and served as prisoners of war. The Tuskegee Airmen flew 1,491 missions during the war. The awards and decorations earned by these flyers include a Silver Star, 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. Those facts speak for themselves. What should be noted, however, is that the racism in this country did not change significantly during the war. Integration of services did not occur until 1948. The heroes that served with the Tuskegee Airmen and other African American units were brought home on segregated ships and returned to the same racism and segregation that they left. There were no parades and no celebrations for the returning African American soldiers or sailors, nor for the Tuskegee Airmen. It took another 6 years for the United States Supreme Court to declare state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students unconstitutional in a case called Brown v. Board of Education. It took another 10 years for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to outlaw major forms of discrimination against racial, ethnic, national, and religious minorities and women to be passed by Congress. The Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, enforced the voting rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. On March 29, 2007, about 300 Tuskegee Airmen, or their widows, received the Congressional Gold Medal from President Bush. On December 9, 2008, they were invited to attend the inauguration of President Barack Obama. So why were these heroes special? Because they made it work. They wanted to serve their country, and despite the odds stacked against them, they did. So how do we honor them? If you want to honor what these men stood for and what they and their sons and daughters have accomplished since then this and future generations need to end the practices of racism and segregation in this country. That is how to best remember the Tuskegee Airmen. World War II also brought change to the status of Native Americans, which had, throughout the history of this nation, been portrayed as outcasts and savages. The original inhabitants of this continent could not envision the future that awaited them when the first foreigners landed on their shores. Establishment of European settlements in this new world brought two distinctly different cultures into contact and ultimately into conflict. A major factor in these conflicts and the resulting treaty disputes was the Native Americans' concept of land. The Indians practiced communal land ownership. That is, the entire community owned the land upon which it lived. Indians fought among themselves over hunting rights to a territory, but the Native Americans' idea of right to the land was very different from the legalistic and individual nature of European ownership. The Indians had no concept of private property as it applied to land. Certainly, the idea of an individual having exclusive use of a particular piece of land was completely foreign to Native Americans. As European settlers established claims to land for their exclusive use and used force to keep others away, it brought them into conflict with the local native tribes, who in turn fought back. In 1795, in his 7th annual message to Congress, Washington indicated that if the U.S. government wanted peace with the Indians, then it must give peace to them. And if the U.S. wanted raids by Indians to stop, then raids by American frontier inhabitants must also stop. In the early 1800s, manifest destiny was a widely held belief in the United States that its settlers were destined to expand across North America. There are 3 basic themes to manifest destiny: the special virtues of the American people and their institutions, the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West in the image of agrarian America, and an irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty. The War of 1812 significantly changed the balance of power on the North American continent. The United States was firmly established as the preeminent power in North America, growing in size and power each passing year. With a military force at its disposal and an expanding need for land, tribal nations faced one of 2 poor choices: accept the terms given by the United States or face annihilation. A mere 15 years after the War of 1812 concluded, President Andrew Jackson introduced the Indian Removal Act of 1830. When the law passed, it gave the United States the green light to formally and legally remove tribal communities under Western law. Before this, no such sweeping law sanctioned by the federal government existed. Prior to this time, compromises and treaties were the only available solutions. Between the year 1783 and the year 1893, America's insatiable thirst for land erased the homelands of Native Americans. While some tribes went willingly, others chose to defend their sacred sites against an enemy that they knew ultimately would win. The Indian Wars of the 1800s became a war for survival of the Indian nations. While there were some notable victories, the final result was never in doubt. Losing Indian lands resulted in a loss of cultural identity, as tribes relied on their homelands as the place of ancestral burial locations and sacred sites where religious ceremonies were performed. Without their lands, nations lost their identities and their purpose. The Dawes Act of 1887 continued to pave the way for citizenship in that members of certain Native American tribes who accepted an allotment of land were considered a citizen. The goal was for Native Americans, through assimilation, to give up their culture and to adopt the habits of civilized life. After World War I, any native who had fought in the war and who had received an honorable discharge was considered a citizen through a congressional act dated November 6, 1919. The underlying assumption of this act was that these particular Indians had demonstrated that they had become part of the larger Anglo culture and were no longer wholly Indian. The passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 granted citizenship to all natives born in America. As a result, Native Americans were finally granted free travel in the United States. Life on reservations was difficult for Native Americans prior to World War II due to low levels of development and lack of economic opportunities. In 1939, the median income for Native American males living on reservations was $500, compared to the national average for males of $2,300. Nearly 1/4 of Native Americans at this time had no formal education, and even for high school graduates, few forms of conventional employment existed on reservations. In the absence of conventional employment, those Native Americans who stayed on the reservations generally worked the land and farmed. With World War II and the need for more soldiers, Congress reaffirmed Native people's citizenship with the Nationality Act of 1940. Native American men were included along with whites in the draft. Initial reactions by Native Americans to the draft were mixed. While some were eager to join the military, others resisted due to their still questionable status as citizens of the United States at the outbreak of the war. Many Native Americans questioned volunteering for military service, as the federal government had the power to force Indians to serve in the military, but did not have the power to compel states to grant Indians the right to vote. Although some resisted the draft, many others who were not drafted volunteered for the war. Unlike African Americans, Native Americans did not serve in segregated units and served alongside their white counterparts. In February of 1942, a white civilian named Philip Johnston came up with an idea of using the Navajo language as a military code. Johnson, a missionary's son, grew up on a reservation and understood the complexity of the Navajo language. By September of 1942, the American government had recruited several hundred Native Americans who spoke both Navajo and English to translate English words into Navajo language to foil enemy understanding. Often working behind enemy lines, the code talkers were commended for their bravery and gained respect from fellow soldiers. Until its declassification in 1968, the code that these Navajo soldiers developed remains the only oral military code never to have been broken by an enemy. The code itself was composed of carefully selected Navajo words that used terms that even a Navajo speaker would not be able to understand without training. For example, there were no words in the Navajo language for military machines, weapons, or foreign countries. So these words were substituted with words that did exist in the Navajo language. Over the course of the war, Native American men fought on all fronts and were involved in many of the most critical battles involving American troops, including Iwo Jima, which was the site of Ira Hayes' triumphant moment in the famous photograph of raising the flag on Mount Suryachi with 4 of his fellow Marines and a Navy corpsman, the invasion of Normandy, the liberation of the Philippines, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of Paris, and the liberation of Belgium. Not counting the Purple Heart, more than 200 military awards were awarded to Native Americans, including 7 Medals of Honor. The Navajo Code Talkers, however, received no recognition until the declassification of the operation in 1968. In 1982, the Code Talkers were given a certificate of recognition by U.S. President Ronald Reagan. As many as 25,000 Native American men actively fought in World War II. These figures represent over 1/3 of the able-bodied Native American men between the ages of 18 and 50, and even included as high as 70% of the population of some tribes. Nearly 800 Native American women served in the military during World War II as nurses or in other fields open to women at that time. However, when some of the 25,000 veterans returned home after the war, they realized that even though they had put their lives on the line for their country, they were still not allowed to vote. 20 years later, in 1965, The Voting Rights Act put an end to individual states' claims on whether or not natives were allowed to vote through a federal law. World War II presented the first large-scale exodus of Native Americans from reservations since the reservation system began, and presented an opportunity for many Native Americans to leave reservations and enter the white world. For many soldiers, World War II represented the first interracial contact between natives living on relatively isolated reservations and the general American population. On December 21, 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a public law which awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 World War II Navajo Code Talkers and silver medals to each person who qualified as a Navajo Code Talker. In July of 2001, U.S. President George W. Bush personally presented the medal to the 4 surviving original Code Talkers at a ceremony held in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Gold medals were also presented to the families of the deceased 24 original Code Talkers. One of the most significant benefits that Native American men and women realized from the war effort was the expectation that new skills would lead to better jobs. Due to both a decreased sense of isolation on reservations brought on by the war and the influx of money, Native Americans began to have access to careers, consumer goods, and services not typically found on reservations. Native Americans have found success in the military, in government service, in entertainment, in science and medicine, and in many other career fields. Despite the hardships that they have faced throughout the history of this nation, they maintain their pride, their dignity, and continue to honor the heritage of their forefathers. For the Japanese American living in the United States at the beginning of World War II, life took a dramatic turn for the worst soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Due in large part to changes stemming from Japan's Industrial Revolution and a recession caused by the abrupt opening of Japan's economy to the world market, people began emigrating from the Empire of Japan in 1868 to find work. From 1869 to 1924, approximately 200,000 immigrated to the islands of Hawaii, mostly laborers expecting to work in the island's sugar plantations. Some 180,000 went to the U.S. mainland, with the majority settling on the West Coast and establishing farms or small businesses. Most arrived before 1908, when a gentleman's agreement between Japan and the United States banned the immigration of unskilled laborers. As the Japanese American population continued to grow, European Americans on the West Coast resisted the new group, fearing competition and exaggerating the idea of hordes of Asians keen to take over white-owned farmlands and businesses. The Immigration Act of 1924, following an example of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, effectively banned all immigration from Japan and other undesirable Asian countries. This 1924 ban on immigration produced unusually well-defined generational groups within the Japanese American community. The Issei were made up exclusively of those who had emigrated from Japan before 1924. U.S. law prohibited Japanese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens and therefore from owning property, voting, or running for political office. Because no new immigration was permitted, all Japanese Americans born after 1924 were, by definition, born in the U.S. and automatically U.S. citizens. These Nisei, or second generation, were a distinct cohort from their parents. Communication between English-speaking children and parents who spoke mostly or completely in Japanese was often difficult. In the 1930s, the Office of Naval Intelligence, concerned by Imperial Japan's rising military power in Asia, began conducting surveillance of Japanese American communities in Hawaii. From 1936, at the behest of President Roosevelt, the ONI began compiling a special list of those who would be the first to be placed in concentration camps in the event of trouble between Japan and the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, led military and political leaders to suspect that Imperial Japan was preparing a full-scale attack on the west coast of the United States. Due to Japan's rapid military conquest of a large portion of Asia and the Pacific between 1936 and 1942, some Americans feared that its military forces were unstoppable. American public opinion initially stood by the large population of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, with the Los Angeles Times characterizing them as good Americans, born and educated as such. Many Americans believed that their loyalty to the United States was unquestionable. But 6 weeks after the attack, public opinion along the Pacific began to turn against Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, as the press and other Americans became nervous about the potential for fifth column activity. Several concerns over the loyalty of ethnic Japanese seemed to stem more from racial prejudice than any evidence of disloyalty. The Roberts Commission report, which investigated the Pearl Harbor attack, was used by national and particularly West Coast media to attack Japanese Americans and inflame public opinion against them. On February 13, 1942, the Pacific Coast Congressional Subcommittee on Aliens and Sabotage recommended to the President immediate evacuation of all persons of Japanese lineage and all others, aliens and citizens alike, who were thought to be dangerous from certain strategic areas. It further specified that these areas included the entire strategic area of California, Oregon, Washington, and the Alaska Territory. On February 16th, the Secretary of War directed that the Commanding General of the Western Defense Command commence evacuations to the extent he deemed necessary to protect vital installations. On 19 February 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military authorities to prescribe military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Although the order did not refer specifically to people of Japanese ancestry, it was targeted largely for the internment of those people from the West Coast. On March 2, 1942, the Commanding General of the Western Defense Command publicly announced the creation of two military restricted zones. Military Area Number 1 consisted of the southern half of Arizona and the western half of California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as all of California south of Los Angeles. Military Area 2 covered the rest of those states. Army-directed evacuations began on March 24, 1942. People had 6 days to dispose of their belongings other than what they could carry. Japanese Americans reported to centers near their homes. These centers were located in remote areas, often reconfigured fairgrounds and racetracks, featuring buildings not meant for human habitation, like horse stalls or cow sheds that had been converted for that purpose. From there, they were transported to a relocation center where they might live for months before transfer to a permanent wartime residence. There were a total of 10 permanent housing camps. These typically consisted of some form of barracks in which several families were housed together with communal eating areas. Each relocation center was its own town, featuring schools, post offices, and work facilities, as well as farmland for growing food and keeping livestock. All were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Somewhere between 110 and 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were subject to this mass exclusion program, of whom about two-thirds were U.S. citizens. The remaining one-third were non-citizens subject to internment under the Alien Enemies Act. Many of these resident aliens had been inhabitants of the United States for decades, but had been deprived by law of being able to become naturalized citizens. These rules included persons of part Japanese ancestry as well. Anyone with at least 1/16th, or equivalent to having one great-great-grandparent of Japanese ancestry, was eligible. Korean Americans and Taiwanese, classified ethnically as Japanese because both Korea and Taiwan were Japanese colonies at the time, were also included. Many internees lost irreplaceable personal property due to restrictions that prohibited them from taking more than they could carry into the camps. Businesses, homes, and possessions had to be sold or entrusted to neighbors or friends. Pets had to be left behind. Alien land laws in the West Coast states barred the Issei from owning their pre-war homes and farms. Many had cultivated land for decades as tenant farmers, but they lost their right to farm those lands when they were forced to leave. In Hawaii, the military imposed martial law, complete with curfews and blackouts. As a large portion of the population was of Japanese ancestry, 150,000 out of a population of 400,000 in 1937, internment was deemed not practical. It was strongly opposed by the island's business community, which was heavily dependent on the labor force of those of Japanese ancestry. It was accurately believed that the internment of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants in Hawaii would have had a catastrophic results for the Hawaiian economy. In the hysteria of the time, some mainland congressmen, as Hawaii was only a U.S. territory at the time, promoted that all Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants should be removed from Hawaii, but were unsuccessful. Wartime hysteria and racial prejudice pushed the country's leadership to violate rights guaranteed under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Even when these injustices were brought to the country's highest court, in the 1944 case, Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court justices ruled that military necessity outweighed the civil rights of Japanese Americans. Most Japanese Americans who fought in World War II were Nisei, born in the United States to immigrant parents. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese American men were initially categorized as 4C, or enemy aliens, and therefore not subject to the draft. Many Nisei worked to prove themselves as loyal American citizens. Of the 20,000 Japanese Americans who served in the Army during World War II, many went to war to fight racism at home, and they felt that they were proving with their blood, their limbs, and their bodies that they were truly American. Some 100 Nisei women volunteered for the Women's Army Corps, where, after undergoing rigorous basic training, had assignments as typists, clerks, and drivers. A smaller number of women also volunteered to serve as nurses for the Army Nurse Corps. Many men deemed proficient enough in the Japanese language were approached or sometimes ordered to join the military intelligence service to serve as translators, interpreters, and spies in the Pacific, as well as the China-Burma-India theater. The U.S. Army called for 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii and 3,000 from the mainland. An overwhelming 10,000 men from Hawaii volunteered. The announcement was met with less enthusiasm on the mainland, where the vast majority of draft-age men of Japanese ancestry and their families were held in internment camps. The Army revised the quota calling for 2,900 men from Hawaii and 1,500 men from the mainland. Only 1,256 volunteered from the mainland during this initial call for volunteers. As a result, around 3,000 men from Hawaii and 800 men from the mainland were inducted. President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team, saying, quote, "Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry," unquote. Ultimately, the draft was reinstated to obtain more Japanese Americans from the mainland, and these made up a large portion of the 14,000 men who eventually served in the 442nd Regiment. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team is best known for its history as a fighting unit composed almost entirely of second-generation American soldiers of Japanese ancestry. Beginning in 1944, the regiment fought primarily in Europe during World War II, particularly in Italy, southern France, and Germany. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was activated on February 1, 1943, and became the most decorated unit in the history of American warfare. The 4,000 men who initially made up the unit in April of 1943 had to be replaced nearly 2 times. In total, about 14,000 men served, earning 9,486 Purple Hearts. The unit was awarded 8 Presidential Unit Citations, 5 of those earned in 1 month. 21 of its members were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, including one who went on to become a United States Senator, serving from 1963 until its death in 2012. To compensate former internees for their property losses, the U.S. Congress on July 2, 1948, passed the American-Japanese Claims Act, allowing Japanese Americans to apply for compensation for property losses which occurred as, quote, "a reasonable and natural consequence of the evacuation or exclusion," unquote. By the time the act was passed, however, the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, had already destroyed most of the internees' 1939 to 1942 tax records. Due to the time pressure and strict limits on how much they could take to the camps, few were able to preserve detailed tax and financial records during the evacuation process. Therefore, it was extremely difficult for claimants to establish that their claims were valid. Japanese Americans still encountered hostility and even violence when they returned to the West Coast after the war. Concentrated largely in rural areas of Central California, there were dozens of reports of gunshots, fires, and explosions aimed at Japanese American homes, businesses, and places of worship. In addition, there were also non-violent crimes like vandalism and the defacing of Japanese graves. In one of the only cases that went to trial, 4 men were accused of attacking a Japanese family in California, setting off an explosion, and starting a fire on the family's farm. Despite a confession from one of the men that implicated the others, the jury accepted their defense attorneys framing the attack as justifiable attempt to keep California, quote, "a white man's country," unquote, and acquitted all 4 defendants. In 1980, under mounting pressure from the Japanese American Citizens League, President Jimmy Carter opened an investigation to determine whether the decision to put Japanese Americans into internment camps had been justified by the government. He appointed the Commission on Wartime Relocation and the Internment of Civilians to investigate the camps. The Commission's report, titled "Personal Justice Denied," found little evidence of Japanese disloyalty at the time and concluded that the incarceration had been a product of racism. He recommended that the government pay reparations to the internees. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the internment on behalf of the United States government and authorized a payment of $20,000 to each camp survivor. The legislation admitted that the government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. Being sent to the camps meant a loss of honor for those to whom honor meant everything. It also meant that many family heirlooms were lost, costing families memories of their past. To volunteer to fight for a country that took so much, and who knew they were being tagged as second-class citizens, took courage beyond the norm. These Americans proved their loyalty to this nation with their service and their sacrifice, despite the hardships that they faced. Women faced many of the same biases during this period in our history. Women had only received the right to vote as a result of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution on June 4, 1919. One of the major changes occurring as a result of the war was the role women play in American society. Most Americans at that time believed that women should not work outside of the home if their husbands held jobs. Education was very gender specific, and high professional qualification was important only for the man. It was felt that workplace was not a concern and that career and professional advancements was deemed unimportant for women. Housekeeping and childcare were the primary functions of the woman, and participation of the man in these functions was only partially wanted. Women were accepted outside of the home as school teachers, secretaries, nurses, telephone operators, and social workers. If they needed to attend college to become teachers or nurses, they attended an all-female college. Once married, however, they were expected to return to the home in their roles as wives and mothers. In the early 1940s, however, the United States was involved in the war. A majority of the male population between the ages of 18 and 48 were involved. The American workforce was stretched to its limits. Women entered the workforce in industry in large numbers as a result of this shortfall. This act opened the door for many advancements for women that we take for granted today. Rosie the Riveter is a cultural icon of the United States, representing the American women who worked in factories during World War II, many of whom produced munitions and war supplies. These women sometimes took entirely new jobs, replacing the male workers who were in the military. Although the image of Rosie the Riveter reflects the industrial work of welders and riveters during World War II, the majority of working women filled non-factory positions in every sector of the economy. What unified the experience of these women was that they proved to themselves and to the country that they could do a man's job and could do it well. In 1942, just between the months of January and July, the estimates of the proportion of jobs that would be acceptable for women were raised by employers from 29% to 85%. African American women were some of those most affected by the need for women workers. Conditions were sometimes harsh, and pay was not equal. For some, World War II represented a major turning point for women as they eagerly supported the war effort. Others emphasized that the changes were temporary and that immediately after the war was over, women were replaced by returning servicemen and expected to return to traditional roles of wives and mothers. Regardless of the position taken, the Rosies and the generations that followed them knew that working outside of the home was in fact a possibility for women. The Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, were civilian female pilots employed by the government to fly military aircraft under the direction of the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. With a large portion of the men either gone to war or working in defense-related industry, qualified pilots were hard to find. Pilots were needed to move wartime supplies and to move military aircraft from the factory to the war. 25,000 women applied to join the WASP, but only 1,830 were accepted and took the oath. Out of these, only 1,074 of them passed the training and joined, each one freeing a male pilot for combat service and duties. They flew over 60 million miles in every type of military aircraft. 38 WASP flyers lost their lives while serving during the war, all in accidents, 11 in training, and 27 on active duty. Because they were not officially part of the military service under the existing guidelines, WASPs had no insurance, no burial or death benefits, no military rank, and no veterans benefits. A fallen WASP was sent home at family expense without traditional military honors or note of heroism. The Army would not even allow the United States flag to be placed on the coffin of a fallen WASP, nor could they be buried at Arlington National Cemetery or at any other military cemeteries across the nation. In March of 1944, Congress considered legislation to militarize the WASPs. On June 21, 1944, a bill in the House of Representatives to give the WASP military status was defeated by only 19 votes. Male pilots lobbied against the bill, reacting to closure of some civilian flight training schools and the termination of 2 male pilot training commissioning programs. As a result of the failure of that bill, the Chief of the Army Air Force ordered that the WASP be disbanded by December 20, 1944. As they were not officially part of the military services, they received no military benefits, no retirement, and no honors. After the war, records of the WASP were classified and sealed. As a result of this restricted access, history minimized or ignored the women pilots. It took over 30 years for America to finally give these heroes some of the hard-earned recognition that they deserved. In 1977, the same year the Air Force graduated its first women pilots, Congress granted veteran status to those who had served as WASP, and in 1979 issued official honorable discharges. This allowed the WASP to gain veteran status and associated health and medical benefits. On May 10, 2010, President Barack Obama, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, House Minority Leader John Boehner, and the United States Congress awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal. Only 3 of the roughly 300 surviving WASP were on hand to witness the event. On January 11, 2016, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots Arlington Internment Restoration Act was passed, granting the surviving WASPs burial rights at Arlington. For the ladies listening to this presentation, you too often take for granted today that you can achieve any career goal desired. Today, you can aspire to be a corporate executive, a pilot, an astronaut, an engineer, a scientist, or a doctor. You could work in technical and theoretical fields. You can also dream of becoming the Speaker of the House of Representatives and, at some point in the future, President of the United States. The world for women was not always that way. Many do not see how the world for women has changed as a result of the war and is still changing today. If you want to thank those who gave you those opportunities, look to the Rosies and the WASPs as you are standing on the shoulders of all those heroes that came before you. World War II also had a significant impact on those that stayed behind. You will find the generation of Americans that lived through the shortages caused by the war have a different perspective on living and spending than most of the generations that followed. Today, we live in a world where grocery and merchandise stores are megastores with shelves that are constantly full. World War II, unlike modern warfare, involved a majority of the male population either in critical industry or in the military. It also resulted in much of the food, oil, gasoline, and other products that the American population took for granted being shipped overseas. In order to guarantee minimum amounts of necessities to everyone, especially the poor, and to prevent inflation, the government instituted a rationing program. It is this concept of wartime rationing that seems to be foreign to those of us today. Many controls were put on the economy as a result of changing wartime priorities. The most important were price controls imposed on most products and monitored by the Office of Price Administration. Wages were also controlled. Corporations dealt with numerous agencies, especially the War Production Board and the War and Navy departments, which had the purchasing power and priorities that largely reshaped, expanded, and directed wartime industrial production. Tires were the first items to be rationed in January of 1942 because supplies of natural rubber were interrupted by the war with Japan. This program, however, proved ineffective in conserving what rubber was available as individuals turned to hoarding tires. Gasoline rationing proved an even better way to allocate scarce rubber as it limited automobile use. The Office of Price Administration had the power to place ceilings on all prices except agricultural commodities and to ration scarce supplies of other items, including shoes, nylon, sugar, gasoline, fuel oil, coffee, meats, and processed foods. Some items, like new automobiles and appliances, were no longer made as those companies geared up for war. To get a classification in a book of rationing stamps, one had to appear before a local rationing board. Each person in a household received a ration book, including babies and small children who qualified for canned milk not available to others. Each ration book page had numbered stamps that limited monthly spending. Prices were listed not only by cost, but by points, with 48 points allocated per ration book per month. Ration stamps were valid only for a set period to forestall hoarding. Purchases in excess of the monthly ration were prohibited, except illegally, through the black market. To receive a gasoline ration card, a person had to certify a need for gasoline and ownership of no more than 5 tires. Families were authorized only one automobile. All tires in excess of 5 per driver were confiscated by the government because of the rubber shortages. When purchasing gasoline, a driver had to display a gas ration sticker in the windshield of their car and present a gas card along with a ration book and cash. All forms of automobile racing were banned, including the Indianapolis 500. By the end of 1942, half of U.S. automobiles were issued an A sticker that allowed 4 gallons of fuel per week. Keep in mind that on an average, most 1940s cars drove between 15 and 20 miles per gallon of gasoline. While strict rationing ended soon after the war, the idea of making do with less was permanently embedded on an entire generation of Americans. Many, throughout their lives, worked with strict food budgets and made the food that they did prepare go as far as possible. As fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce throughout the war, many grew their own in what came to be referred to as victory gardens. What they could not consume during the harvest season had to be preserved for future use. You will find many of that generation still have vegetable gardens and still preserve fruits and vegetables. They continue to limit entertainment expenses that they consider frivolous. In effect, they were locked into a period in time that many of us will never understand. That generation gap still exists today. After the war, American industry once again returned to the production of goods and services other than war materials. As a result, the economy grew. Technological innovations that we take for granted today first appeared during this period with the development of early computers and the first televisions, outgrowths of wartime programs. The high levels of productivity started by President Roosevelt before the war continued after the war and lasted until the early 1970s. Manufacturing was aided by wartime advances in automation technologies. Wholesale and retail trade benefited from the new highway systems, distribution warehouses, and material handling equipment made necessary by modern warfare. Rapid normalization of political relations between former Axis powers and the Western Allies also played a part in the return to normalcy. After the war, the major powers, perhaps taking a lesson from history, were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the Great Depression, some of which were blamed on post-World War I policy errors. One wartime innovation, however, was to irreversibly change the world. War brings rapid change to many things, particularly governments and political lines on a map. Other changes only last as long as the conflict. Public hysteria, often fueled by public officials and the media, sometimes caused hidden prejudices to surface. After the war, the American population wanted to return as quickly as possible to the way it used to be. Gains made to the status of women, African Americans, and Native Americans were quickly forgotten in the rush to return to normalcy. In these areas, however, the roots of change had been planted and would be realized over time. Damage to cultural relationships caused by the war would also heal over time. These are the hard changes involving altering people's values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Making changes to the way people think, how they act, what they teach their children, and what they believe takes a little longer. When you take a look at the world today, many of the current conflicts are not about politics, but over ideologies, values, or beliefs. Those changes are perhaps the hardest of all.